Ornamentation is one of the most distinctive elements of Baroque music. It can heighten drama at places where there's tension and resolution. It can take a melodic line and embellish it and make it florid and more beautiful. And in general, it grabs our attention and makes us really fall in love with the music. The whole point of ornamentation, in fact, like all Baroque music, is to move the affects of the listener, the passions, to make you feel something. It's a form of rhetoric that's meant to do work on you as a listener. And if we're doing it well, then we can push and pull our listeners' emotions in various directions. That might sound a little bit manipulative, but that's actually the way that Baroque art in general was approached, and especially Baroque music. There were different devices used to move the affects of the listener, including ornamentation. So the bit that I just played for you was from J.S. Bach's Lure from BWV 1006, which is the third violin partita or the fourth lute suite. And it features a lot of ornamentation. Some of it is written in symbols, others are written out in notation, and some others I've added here. But it's a wonderful example of the kind of ornamentation that we encounter in Baroque music. Now, in this video, I want to give you a practical guide on how to begin getting familiar with and learning ornamentation. It's quite an advanced technique, I would say, in general, not only to learn to improvise your own ornaments, but simply the actual mechanical motions that are required for ornaments, and in the Baroque music in particular. It's tricky. It's quite advanced because we're having to play things pretty rapidly with the left hand in particular, usually, in such a way that we don't disrupt the forward motion of the pulse. That requires a lot of virtuosity and control with the left hand. So to get us started, I'm offering you in this video a worksheet that you can find in the description of the video with some exercises. And those exercises are meant to build up your ornaments one by one, bit by bit. And we're focusing on the three most essential and most frequent ornaments that you'll encounter in Baroque music: the mordent, the trill, and the appoggiatura. Each of those function in different ways, though they're related to one another as well in certain ways. So let's talk just for a moment about what each one is, and I'll walk you through the exercises after that. Appoggiare in Italian means leaning or to lean, and it implies a harmonic leaning of a dissonance into its resolution. So there's tension that then resolves. And that motion of tension and resolution, suspension and release, is the most common type of appoggiatura that you'll encounter. This one, where it's long and emphasized on the first note and then backs off on the next note. It's very frequent in Baroque music. There are other kinds of appoggiaturas, but that's the one that we'll encounter most frequently, where we have a slight accent on the first note and then backs off on the second note, and usually they're a little bit longer. Fast appoggiaturas, where there's an accent on the second note, what we would today think of as an acciaccatura, is also common in Baroque music, especially in faster music. Pieces that have a faster meter or tempo will feature that kind of appoggiatura. And notice I don't use the word acciaccatura because it wasn't a term that was used in to describe this kind of grace note in the Baroque period. Acciaccatura was used for something entirely different, in fact, a keyboard technique, in Italian music in particular. But that grace note that we see before a principal note, the tiny little note that comes just before a big note in the notation, can function in both ways. Sometimes it's on the beat and accented on the first note and backs off on the second note. And at other times, it's pre-beat and the second note receives the emphasis. How to know the difference between the two will largely depend on the musical context. Like I said, faster music with a little bit of a faster meter, those kinds of pieces will generally benefit more from the shorter, more appoggiatura-like kind of appoggiaturas than a long cadential harmonic appoggiatura like we first found with this A suspension. So to that effect, the exercises that I've given you here have accents. On the first line, we're working on quarter notes, and those quarter notes have an accent on the first note and then back off on the second note. Your slur technique is really important for all of the ornaments in this worksheet. So if you haven't yet worked on slurs, that's the first thing to do before you begin building up your ornaments. Something to keep in mind is that we want on notes that are not accented to have a very even volume between the two notes, and that's done by the action of the slurring finger. How quickly it gets back down to the string. Vice versa, if we're working on descending slurs, it's the same thing. If we're working on an unaccented pair of slurs, we want the second note to be about the same volume as the first, and that's done by the motion of the first finger coming downward slightly, and the other finger, the slurred finger, holding the string in place. We don't want to bend the string like that. We don't want to snap like that either, or we get a harsh and different kind of sound on the second note. We want to make them even. So you'll first need to work on that technique, on ascending and descending slurs for all of your finger combinations to make sure that you can make them nice and even. That way you can work on varying the amount of pressure that you get, so you have accents, and you can actually choose how much emphasis to place on either note. And so the exercises that I've given you, they build up in tempo, starting from quarter notes, going to eighth notes, and then to sixteenths. And you'll notice that the accents are different. On the quarter notes and the eighth notes, the accent is on the first note. Because in general, those longer cadential or harmonic appoggiaturas that we talked about will be longer in duration, and you'll find them in slower pieces as well. Whereas the faster appoggiaturas that you'll encounter in faster music, I've placed the accent on the second note. Very much again like an appoggiatura. So we want the accent on the second note. So that's really important for these appoggiaturas, that you can distinguish the pressure that you're using either on the to emphasize different notes within the slurred pair. And so that's the appoggiaturas. Mordere in Italian means to bite or biting, and it has a kind of biting effect. Very quick, and we start on a principal note, go down to the lower neighbor note, and then return back to the principal note very quickly in most cases. There are exceptions to this, of course, where sometimes we'll have a slower mordent, like that. There are also times you'll notice I'm playing them on successive frets, that is, on semitones or half steps apart. And a lot of Baroque music features semitone mordents, but there are plenty of mordents that are also diatonic. So for instance, J.S. Bach's Largo from BWV 1056 from the keyboard concerto in F minor. In our grade 4 curriculum at the Academy, that piece starts with a mordent. It's a very slow mordent though, and it's also diatonic. If we were to make it into a semitone, it would sound like this, which obviously doesn't fit the harmony of the piece. And so there are situations where you'll need to know the harmony and some other details of the music to know what fits best within the music. But the finger combinations I've given you are mostly, I think only in fact, for working out your semitone or half-step alternations. Mm-hmm. So the first exercise uses two different articulations in the right hand, separating two slurs, like this. And And here I would encourage you to, unlike the appoggiaturas, to try to keep these notes nice and even in volume. So we want a pretty strong sound on the second note, which will require some good control of your slur technique. But the point is to have two distinct motions before we move on to the second exercise, which only uses one articulation, which requires even more control from your left hand, because the left hand is actually putting more action into the string. Because not only is it pulling down for the descending slur, but then it needs to hammer back on for the ascending slur, all in one motion. So we start out with eighth notes, and I would encourage you to use a metronome so you're making these very rhythmic. Making it rhythmic allows you to be more in control of the motion of the fingers, and then we step it up to 16th notes. Except you're not articulating the second note with the right hand, it's only one articulation, so all of the motion is done with the left hand finger. All the way down the fretboard and back up, or all the way down the strings and then back up. You could, of course, then move on from that to a pure mordant, so doing it basically as fast as you can do it. Making it really nice and snappy and biting. And then from there, you have more control because we've worked on slow mordants, which you'll encounter in some music that's slower in character, and then also fast mordants, which is very appropriate for faster music that has a livelier meter. The trill is actually very similar to the appoggiatura in that in its most frequent use case in Baroque music, it happens at cadences where there's a harmonic tension that then resolves. So we have dissonance that resolves down. But you'll notice it's very similar to an appoggiatura in that sense, and they're actually interchangeable. One test is that you can use for what kind of appoggiatura to use in music, in fact, is can it be substituted for this kind of trill. Sorry? That sort of harmonic trill where we emphasize the first note and back off on the second note, on the resolution. So trills are always found at cadences in Baroque music. In fact, there are many places in Bach's music and in other composers' music where a trill is not written at the cadence because it was simply expected the performer would add one anyway. But in a lot of cases in our modern editions of Baroque music, a trill is usually added at a cadence. So for instance, if we're moving from the, like I just played there, from the 5 chord, from the dominant chord to the 1, we'll have a trill, a cadential trill on the 5 chord that moves to the 1. It's a very common place to find a trill in Baroque music. There are other kinds of trills though. For instance, in the G major invention, the two-part inventions in G major, there are these long-held notes in the top voice that are filled out by trills. And those are not cadential, they're not meant to be harmonic tensions that resolve, they're decorative and melodic. And so we have these notes that fill out a very long held note with even alternation. So instead of wait, that then progressively backs off on the next set of notes, for these other kinds of trills, we have an even alternation. So similar to what we did with the appoggiaturas, I didn't include accents in these exercises, but you might want to add in some accents and also remove accents to work on that evenness between your slurs and when to bring in different emphasis on certain notes. So the two exercises that I've given you, the first one is speed bursts. This is going to help you build up to the speed of trills because they need to be quite quick to be performed well, especially in livelier music. And this is all just a set of slur exercises. You'll note every one of them, you only articulate the first note, and then all of the rest is done with the slurring action in the left hand. So use the I finger, or you can use the M, of course, it doesn't really matter. The right hand is unimportant here. What we're going to do, though, is all action in the left hand there, and then articulate the first note of the next measure. And here I'm giving you an example of making all of the notes even, but you could also do an accent on the first note and then backing off on all the alternations that follow. That's again going to require some control of your slur technique. And then finally, the last exercise for the trills requires you to have a fixed bass note, and in fact a barre. And the reason is, in so much Baroque music where, for instance, like this A chord that I played at the very beginning, we're holding on to other notes, or other notes might in fact be moving while we're trilling. It's quite challenging because in contrapuntal music, like a lot of Baroque music, we have to have that independence. So this exercise is going to challenge you to hold on to one voice or one finger while the other finger is moving. So here we're going to do a barre on the first 3 strings to start. And then we move to a barre on the first 4 strings. One thing to note about that, by the way, I'm letting that first string buzz. Even though it's a 4-string barre, I don't actually need the strength of the barre. All that I need is for the first finger to cover the 4th string and the 2nd string. So that's all I need my finger to be pushing into the fret. And the same thing here, moving down to the 5th string, and then the 6th string. Back up. If you can make that rhythmic shift with your barre, all the better. That will train you to be very fast with your motions and still be in control of the slurring motion. Now, on all of these exercises, you'll notice there are variations where I give you different finger combinations. I encourage you not to just do 2-1 like I've been doing here, but to use all of the variations and find which finger combination is weakest. Usually it'll be 3-2 or 4-3 or vice versa. 2-3 and 3-4 are usually the weakest combinations, and you might want to spend more time with the weaker combinations of fingers. So I hope this helps out. I think this is a great entryway into ornaments. It utilizes very heavily slur technique, so make sure that your slurs are really nice and accurate, and you're in pretty good control of them before you begin working on these. But I think it will be so wonderful to bring ornamentation into your music making, so I hope you enjoy this process.